We'd like to welcome you to the virtual kitchen table. We are Haley from Taking a Kinder Path, Ashley from Ashley as Mama and Storytime Shelves, and myself, Erin, from Everlearning. We're gathering to have conversations about family life and home education, most specifically unschooling, which is sometimes known as self-directed education, or as I often refer to it, whole life learning. We'll be sharing experiences and ideas, learning as we go. We hope you'll pull a chair up to the table and join us. Welcome to the virtual kitchen table. I am back with Haley and Ashley. How are you both?
Yeah, good. Hi,
Hello.
Erin. Hi, Haley.
I think
Hello. Yep.
Hi, Haley. Sorry, I'm talking over you there. I think it's our first 2024 recording. It won't be, excuse me, I'm going to be dealing with my voice a little bit today. It won't be our first episode out in 2024, but I think this is the first time that we've connected again in the new year. So, so we are talking today about something we are calling, we're not sure where the conversation will go, but the idea is the concept of emotional labor. So something kind of happened simultaneously, I think, that got me thinking about this, which is that I noticed that Ashley had posted something in an online group. Ashley, you had said you were reading a book called Emotional Labor, which I believe is by Rose Hackman. Yeah, you can correct me later if I've got any of that wrong, but I think that's the title and the author. And just kind of at the same time as that, we were going through this process where one of our longtime cats had gotten very ill, and we were kind of nursing him, through it seemed like 24/7 until we could get a vet appointment. And I started to just be aware of the emotional process involved in that. And I think there was one night I ended up thinking of the word, which, it's a known term, but anticipatory grief, because we knew we had 2 or 3 days still until the vet was able to come do a home visit. And we knew by that point that we were going to need to have him put down. He was just at such a point of suffering. And just sort of like watching the grief process of different family members and then my own, kind of this impending event, right? And how we all dealt with that differently. And there were a lot of really kind of good pieces that came out of it, in as far as watching how people maybe like accommodated each other's grief and considered each other's grief. But there was one moment in particular where I think for like 3 or 4 weeks, I'd just been pretty practical about it. Christmas had been in the mix there, and New Year's. And, we tried to get him to our regular vet a couple times. So there had just been a lot of practical pieces to deal with. And so then finally the one night, it was just, I think, a couple of nights before we knew he would be passing away. And I just, I finally cried and I just burst into tears. And I remember trying to not hide it, but not emphasize it to my daughter, who was taking a kind of a different way of coping. And it wasn't so much that I was pretending that I wasn't sad or I wasn't ashamed of crying. It was more, she had taken a different approach to these last couple of nights. And she was, she was really celebrating his life. And so we were kind of on 2 different paths of how we were looking at these 2 last nights. And then of course, other family members kind of fell in different places, kind of with their grief as well. And what hit me was just how much we hold, right? So we hold our own feelings. And then I think as human beings, certainly, but maybe even more so as parents, we are also holding the big picture of sometimes a variety of people and their feelings and their thoughts and their circumstances. And it just hit me how, as much as it was a really meaningful experience to kind of go through this as a family, it really is, there's an emotional weariness to it. And then, I even was planning past that. I was thinking, okay, we're thinking of burial and how's our other cat going to cope? And, we've done this with losses of people in our lives as well, how you just kind of look at this situation and then maybe you project ahead a little bit too and kind of imagine it from different people's perspectives. And yeah, for me, I tend to, what I know about myself is that I often, if I'm really mentally taxed or emotionally taxed, I'll often end up with a headache or sometimes stomach, but it's usually a headache. And so I was almost like planning, when this is all over, I need a day to just be sick. I know I'm going to have a migraine kind of thing. And I actually didn't get one, which was interesting. But it just made me think about how we hold all these pieces. And sometimes it does manifest physically. And even though we usually want to hold, sometimes we're holding more than we want to, but these are just things in life and we want to be considerate of people. But I think too, it just led me to think how we really have to be considerate of ourselves as well, because I think it's useful to acknowledge kind of all the pieces that we hold at once. And as parents, I think we're doing that in some small way. It might not be a big grief event, but in some small way, we do that through the day, between siblings. If our kids have a friend over, we're navigating both personalities. We're wanting the best, we're wanting to be welcoming to our host, and we're also wanting it to work out for our child. So I just kind of became interested in this idea about emotional labor and kind of how much of a part of our lives I think it is. So, I don't know what comes up for either of you, or Ashley, if you want to talk about the book at all, or whether you've what you've kind of found from that would be great too.
Yeah. So the book is called Emotional Labor, and then it goes on to say the invisible work shaping our lives and how to claim our power. And that's by Rose Hackman, as you shared, Erin. And then I'll just also mention, so I don't forget, what led me to finding out about this book was Rachel Rainbolt's Sage Family podcast. She has an episode all about emotional labor, and her guest was Rose Hackman. And I listened to that episode, and I could say it was even like an aha moment for me when I first listened to the episode, because it wasn't like they were talking about stuff that I had never thought about, but it just put language to it. And so I found that episode really, really interesting, and I got the book from the library. There's another book actually that I haven't read on the topic. I think it's called Fed Up is the title or part of the title, and I'm not going to be able to think of the author's name, but there is some work out there on it, and I think there's more like writing and more academia, like research and stuff on emotional labor that I think will be interesting to dive into. But it got me thinking a lot about the emotional labor I see other people do in my life, the emotional labor that I do on a daily basis as you said, Erin, like as a parent, as a mom, as a homeschool parent, as a wife, as a sister, as a daughter-in-law, and not just the emotional labor that I'm currently observing and doing myself, but also the emotional labor in my past and when I really didn't know about it, but was doing it. And, what I would have probably just described as being a nice person, being a nice, kind, considerate, thoughtful person, could have probably been said to be like a people pleaser. Again, it's just, I have found it really helpful to have that term emotional labor, because I think that allows me to just understand what's truly going on a bit more. And the piece of it being that it is work. Because I remember saying in this podcast to you guys, one of the episodes, maybe more than one episode, how I can just feel so tired or drained by the end of the day after having, these days that I am enjoying with the kids at home, but feel exhausted and look back and go, I don't really know why I'm this exhausted. And I think I kind of just put it as well, that's how you feel as a parent, especially a parent as young kids, maybe. Um, but now looking back under this like emotional labor lens, I can think about how it really is. I think Rose in her book talks about emotional labor as it takes skill, effort. Oh, I'm going to get this wrong. Time. Like it really is a form of work. So that's been helpful to think about it in that way. And not that it's, that doesn't make it a bad thing, but it explains why we can feel so tired or why we might get a headache afterwards if we've done a bunch of it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to having the conversation and hearing what you guys have to say about it as well.
Yeah, when you said about the book, Ashley, I looked it up and thought, oh yeah, definitely, I want to read that. And I did a little bit of reading around about the term emotional labour, and apparently it started off being something to do with work, if you like. I think it was a study that was done. I don't know. I'm going to say the 1980s, but I don't know if I'm right about that or not. But I think whoever was the author of this study was looking at jobs like flight attendants, cabin crew. I'm not sure what the right term is, and jobs like that where there's a lot of onus on those people to be really calm and sensitive to everybody else's views. And if anybody's getting upset, then their job is to calm people down. And of course, if you're on an aeroplane, you've got to, it's a very, it can be a very tense, enclosed environment, can't it? And I guess as a flight attendant, you've got to, you've got to be the face of reassurance, haven't you? If there's any turbulence or things like that that people are worried about, and shopkeepers as well, things like people who work in shops, they were saying, if people come in and complain, then there's a lot of emotional labor in terms of getting to the specific problem, I guess, and trying to, not inflame situations where people are very upset about something, so that you can actually resolve whatever the problem is. So I think, yeah, so I think that was when the term came about. And then I think, it got extended then to looking at kind of the hidden work, I suppose, that we all do as individuals in society, but particularly, I guess, they were looking at mothers or primary caregivers and how that relates to families and children. And I guess that's our first, when we have a baby, our babies, they're not capable of regulating their own emotions, are they? So that is our kind of first job, isn't it? I guess is part of enabling, being there for them so that they can co-regulate alongside us. So it yeah, it's a big it's a big it's important, isn't it? Not only is it, it's really important in all kinds of realms. So I think it's a really important topic for us to be talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Haley, that's interesting. I never just to add in the piece about like the flight attendants and shopkeepers and things like that. That makes so much sense. And I'm not even sure if I'm really talking about it. I think there's probably overlap, but I don't want to suggest I'm talking about it purely maybe in the way that Rose Hackman was. I think, I might be going in a few different directions with it, but it was like the timing of hearing that title for me made a lot of sense for what I was kind of experiencing that week. So I like the fact that we can kind of look at it from some different angles. And I guess a couple things that came up. So Ashley, when you were talking about like feeling tired by the end of the day at times, or I'm not sure if that's quite the word you used, but it's also interesting. I have found it interesting to look into like different personality types and different, just the neurology that we each have, right? Because we're also different as far as what our sensitivities are, whether they are like physical sensitivities or whether we have kind of, deep emotional sensitivities, either ourselves or toward other people. And just really recognizing that is taxing on your system in this, not in the same way, but in a just as valid a way as doing physical labor or intellectual labor. There was a book that I read as part of a book club a few years ago, called The Powerful Purpose of Introverts. I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll put it in the list as well. But what I found fascinating about that is just understanding that, you know, I tend to be more of an introverted person. And so that probably combined with some other factors, I'm taking in a lot of stimulation and a lot of observing and a lot of listening in, say, like a family gathering or a party somewhere or whatnot. I'm taking in a lot of pieces. And so, you know, that has to go somewhere, that accumulates, and it makes sense. You know, what you're saying, Ashley, at the end of the day, if you are with your children and maybe you're also interacting with their activities and other people that they're interacting with, like, I know each day is different, but it makes sense that over the day you take in all that stimuli, and depending on your personality and kind of the particular neurology of who you are, that for some of us, that is really tiring. And then, you know, Haley, just to your point about different jobs. So I think because I work in social work and I work with various families, and my role is not to come in with my own opinion on things. I'm listening. I'm offering tools and big picture thinking, and I'm doing write-ups and I'm doing all of those things, but I'm doing it based on what their experience is and what their feelings are. So the result of that is, you know, at the end of a day, I can have a lot of different people's perspectives and feelings and challenges. So if I'm not conscious of sort of what I'm doing with that accumulated, I'm going to call it accumulated stimuli, or, you know, you can see how that can really overload a person and can build and build and build. And I think that, you know, we don't want to be detached people. And you do see people use that as I even saw some of this with this grief experience I was talking about, where, you know, I would spend a certain amount of my time detaching from the situation. And we had a couple people in our family who really detached from it. And that's okay. That's kind of the choice that they made. But yeah, it's interesting to see the different tools we each use too, to sort of manage, like, how much do I want to engage in emotional labor right now or not?
I think it's a matter of energy, isn't it? Yeah, sometimes on two levels. Sometimes we have more energy to deal with it, but also it is generating energy, if you like you were saying, Erin. I definitely relate to the headaches. That's definitely something. I get headaches, and I guess they, you know, sometimes definitely have come around the same time as maybe I've been doing a lot of emotional labor. So there's the fact that energy is, I guess, being built up in our systems, and we're expending energy, but also we're accumulating energy that somehow has to be released and discharged, I guess. And that's and different people have different ways of dealing with that, like you say, and sometimes we can deal with it quite close to the situation, and other times we need space and time before we can process those things, don't we? And I guess it's that will depend so much, won't it, on different people's, like you say, temperaments and sensitivities, and I guess also the kind of support that's around and whatever else is going on, because it's when we think about grief, it's sort of the hardest time is often after all the practical things have been done, isn't it? And after people have dealt with things like funerals and belongings and practical stuff, it can be quite a way down the line that they're actually able to process those emotions that have got stored up, can't it? It's not always something close to the event, and we can be a bit hard on ourselves, can't we? I think that we don't always know, you know, where those. Yeah, we can't always link things together, can we, in terms of events or things that have happened, and then our emotional ness down the line.
Yeah. Well, and do you think too, I'm curious, like something that I've been thinking about, you know, leading up to the holiday season, there's a lot of talk in the kind of home ed world about the holidays and navigating the holidays. And some of that is like busyness, right? It's the same conversation that everybody in society is having. How do we kind of enjoy our time and not get overloaded? Some of it, I think, is more specific to the actual sort of like the dynamics at a family gathering or a holiday party, maybe around questions about homeschooling and that kind of thing. But I also wonder if kind of the path that we are going down, and we're kind of talking a lot about, connected parenting, and there's a lot of parenting conversation within the homeschool world. And so I wonder too, if we are, because we navigate a lot of this with our own children, more hours in the week, are we also having an increased sensitivity? And I mean that in a good way, mostly, when we're at family gatherings where we're kind of extending that to other people as well. So for me, if I was going to a family gathering or a group gathering of some kind around the holidays, I would be thinking about what would work well for my kids. But I'm also, it's like there's a whole big picture going on where I want to make sure that things are going well for other people too. So, an example I can think of are times we've been places and maybe there's a game being played, and I know that there's, either a child or an adult who's not very comfortable with their skills in that area or whatever. I don't know, maybe if some people don't notice that, but for me, I'm kind of like, I'm aware of that. And I'm trying to figure out how to make that, how to kind of handle that sensitively, or, whether it's gift opening or any of those sorts of things. I think that I just have it on my radar a little bit more sometimes than other people do. And I wonder if that's the case for lots of people who are having these conversations about sort of, connected parenting and respectful parenting, that we're often, it's not just our kids, we're thinking about other people's kids. And in fact, we're just extending it in general, to whoever's there. And so I don't know, I guess I'm just curious if you think that at all, or if you think that, are other people talking about the holidays as much as the homeschool world does? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I can say, just upon reflecting and listening to you talk about that now, Erin, that I think I've probably become not only more aware of that emotional work I've been doing around holidays and family gatherings and stuff, but I think I've probably improved my skill set around it, because as a parent, and then on top of that, a homeschool parent, I do spend a lot of time thinking about my kids, their feelings, where their feelings are at, like even monitoring them, what their experiences are going to be like, or are going to be like. So it's like the emotional work before, during, and after. I mean, it could be everything, events, and then just everyday stuff. And it's kind of like, once I realized that I could become aware and pay attention and really care about my children's feelings and experiences, I can do that with anyone that I care about, or even people I don't know. I'm just even thinking about little examples of, I'll try not to get off track here, but I notice the difference between my husband and I when we go through like a coffee shop drive-through. We'll go through the Tim Hortons drive-through, and my interaction with the worker there that's serving me that I don't know, is pretty upbeat and friendly and positive, and I'm polite and I'm saying thank you. And whereas my husband goes through and he's not rude, but he doesn't seem to put on the same level of friendliness, or he might not say thank you. I think he often does, but I can definitely see a difference. And I know there's actually even been times where my husband or my kids, I guess I'm judging them a bit on how much emotional labor they're doing. I don't realize I'm doing this at the time, but I notice I'll be smiling even bigger behind them to try to make up for their lack of smile. I don't know if I'm making sense with that. I went off a little bit there, but I do think once I started really paying close attention, because like you said, Haley, that's kind of part of our role, I think, as a parent, is to try to I don't know how to put it, like navigate our children's feelings, not control them, but just be aware of them, almost take on the responsibility in a way of our children's feelings. I find it almost hard not to do that with other people. Like you said, like Aaron, if my kids have a friend over, I'm definitely paying attention to the experience that that child's having. Are they comfortable? Are they having a good time? Do they feel safe? Are they having fun? And I think it is because that is, I think, very much invisible work. That's where it can become problematic. Doing that type of work, I think, is great and wonderful, and really important to care work and just relationships. But it does come at a cost. And I think that's the part that I really didn't realize until recently. And I might pause there, but at some point I think it would be nice to get into a little bit about around the idea of why women are often, and maybe why moms are often the ones doing a lot of emotional work. Because after I did reading about that, yeah, I mean, we can get into that a little bit more, because I don't want to move away from your question too much, Aaron, about what that experience is like for us around other people and extending it to other people. But I think that it's hard to not have gender kind of come into that conversation around moms and dads, or just men and women too. So we can come back to that. I won't go down that road quite yet.
Yeah, so I cannot tell you how much I relate to the smiling a bit bigger behind people that, I maybe have decided aren't smiling quite enough, or saying thank you or whatever. And, it's a hard, it's like a compensation, right? It's like you're compensating for their lack of friendliness or emotion, or maybe what we deem manners or whatever. Yeah, and I find that a really interesting thing, because on the one hand, I guess, and from the little bit of the book that I read, I only read some sample pages of it, Ashley, but from the first example she gave, it feels like, yeah, there is a lot of gender stuff there, as far as women, yeah, just kind of saving the day a lot, right? Like holding the keeping everything nice and keeping everything together. And I think on the one hand, I can see some of the downsides of that, and I've actually had a couple of my kids mention that to me before, about the way that I can be with people. And so it's something that's kind of interesting to sort of, I don't know, reflect on. The other part of me thinks that I'm very thankful that women tend to do that, because it does help us all. There's a cohesion that happens from that ability to extend that extra bit of emotion. And I'm not saying that men don't sometimes do that too, but I think, to your point, that often tends to be something that mothers hold, sort of that hosting role and kind of keeping all the moving parts. I mean, a sort of a less visible, but just as integral part of that would be things like, birthdays or Mother's Day or things like that, where I think a lot of women are thinking not only of getting maybe presents for their own side of the family, but many of us are also just maybe checking in to see if the other side of the family has been thought of or purchased or whatever. And sometimes that just falls within an agreed upon division of labor. Like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think for women to kind of take on that present buying, sympathy card buying kind of role. But there are a lot of pieces there that I think sometimes I am kind of running out to do the extra thing, or make sure that the sympathy card is bought, or make sure that whatever. And part of my brain is kind of like, this feels like a lot of pieces that I'm doing, but I'm sure in conversation, my husband, who will be editing this episode, so we'll find out what he thinks. There's probably lots of things on his end too that he's probably doing that I'm not necessarily noticing. So I guess what I'm saying is, it's hard for me to know sometimes how much is an unfair load and how much is sort of a natural division of things that sometimes females tend to do a bit more naturally, or maybe have some natural inclination toward. And then we could get into a whole conversation about, is that natural inclination socialized, or is it like innate? You know, like we could go so far, but it's just kind of fun to like ponder, right? Like just so.
Yeah,
sorry, I kind of blew that whole thing up.
I think there's two things that stood out to me. There was the hidden bit again. Like I can't remember which of you mentioned that before. Because it is hidden, then Erin, it is hard, isn't it, for your husband or for you to know how much the other person is doing, because it's hidden, because we can't see it. It's all happening in our heads. So that's a really interesting thing. And I think there is an issue of power and the kind of cultures that we may have been raised in. And I think it's not just in terms of men and women, I guess, but I think it's also in terms of it's not just in terms of men and women. I was also thinking about anybody in society, perhaps, or if you feel more vulnerable in society, and perhaps sometimes thinking about home education, I guess sometimes we might feel like that. But also I'm thinking of, different cultural groups, I guess, people who perhaps, people of color or different sexualities, that kind of stuff. You may feel, if you're feeling more vulnerable, then you may feel, and the power dynamic makes it such that you might be in a position where you end up expending more emotional labor to kind of keep things running smoothly, I guess, maybe to keep yourself a bit safer. Does that make sense? And I wonder specifically, as as we talk about home education in this podcast, I'm guessing for not only is there a very I guess because we live in the society that we live in, there may be a lot of families where it is the mother who is the one who stays at home, and perhaps it is the mother who might have been more involved with school, this is obviously not always the case, but might have been the person who learned about home education, might have been the person who then is the one who brings the idea into the home. I mean, from my personal experience, that is what happened with us. It was me that learned about home education, ironically from work, but yeah, and so I guess I was the driving force rather than my husband. I've just said a lot of different things there, haven't I? But
no, it's just a lot of different things that are brought up, a lot of different thoughts for you.
Sorry.
So no, I agree with you that you could take the same situation and it could be, a very different amount of emotional labor for different people. And the first example that popped up for me is that, so for some of the people that I work with who would have a disability, and sometimes I've done like job searches and then sort of been part of the initial interviewing and orientation process. And that is a lot, the anticipation of kind of them going in and kind of getting a sense of how they're going to be received, the emotional labor involved in them going, but then the emotional labor involved for the people who are advocating and supporting them is actually quite a lot. There's are added elements there, because not only are you starting a new job, which anybody feels some most people feel some apprehension about, there's another layer of how you're going to be perceived, right? So there's, and maybe that's probably mental labor as well, not just emotional, but there's definitely, I think, some emotional pieces there where there are just these added pieces. And so I think for many, especially now in the home education world, I think that's probably relatable for a lot of parents who maybe have children with, just different situations, whether, however they frame that, whether that's neurodiversity, whether that's disabilities, whether that's maybe some mental health challenges. It's like you have the regular situation that already requires thinking and feeling, and then you're adding another piece to that. And that, just to kind of float. So I'm not sure if it's kind of connected, but we'll see where it goes. I was thinking about my years in facilitating like a homeschool group. And so, you might have a new family joining, and sometimes those families, sometimes maybe those kids did have differences in the way that they learned or processed information. And, I would be wanting to be very welcoming. And so it's another situation where I would kind of be looking at things from a variety of angles. I'm wanting to welcome the parents. So I'm wanting to make sure that maybe they have an opportunity to be introduced to people, and that the other parents are, being inviting and including them. And then, of course, I'm thinking about things from their children's perspectives. But then I'm also trying to gauge things from other kids' perspectives, because you have new kids coming into settings and you've got different dynamics with kids. And I think, I guess I'm kind of introducing a new line of thought here through this, but I think about, how much talking we do about consent with our kids and respect, is that sometimes as a parent, okay, I'm going to try to articulate this. As a parent, I'm asking, or I was when my kids were younger, asking my kids to be kind of extra welcoming and extra inviting at times that they themselves may not have their tanks totally full, or they're navigating their own social dynamics with their friends. And I'm saying, hey, we've got some new people here, please include them, please welcome them in. And usually that happened in some form or another. But there have been times when personalities have clashed, or the neurology of my kids and those kids have clashed a little bit. And you're kind of working with, we also don't want to be over dictating or over directing what our kids have to do or who they have to socialize with all the time. So, and I definitely was more directive about that when they were little, around that kind of thing. Like, I know that was really important to me, that my kids included new kids, not just new kids, just I was that parent that would not want to see somebody left out of being invited to a birthday party. So I do know that I pushed past my kids' preference, maybe even consent at times. I think it's a hard line. And I have one child in particular who has, shown me that in different ways. And the fact that it's like the easiest going personality in the family, it's like, oh, okay. because they will kind of show me like, here's my line, actually, so that's just, I always find that an interesting conversation, and an interesting maybe aspect of it when we think of emotional labor, is that we want these things. We want people to get along and to be happy, and we want to be good hosts, and we don't want to push past our children's comfort level either. So, yeah.
Well, we live, most of us, I guess, live in a society as well where all emotions aren't welcomed, are they? So if you're, and that differs, I think, between different cultural groups and between men and women, and the thing about, I guess, sometimes the idea that if a man is angry, then that might be because he's got very strong convictions, whereas if a woman expresses anger, then sometimes they're written off as being a bit hysterical. And perhaps, I'm kind of giving a big sort of, general kind of example, but that's one comparison that I think I've definitely experienced or witnessed or whatever in life, and I think that makes it hard. While we're raising children, we want our children to learn about emotions, to be able to name their emotions, to be able to express their emotions. But then we're also living in the society that perhaps is going to judge our children if they do express those emotions too freely. So it's quite a difficult line to draw. And I think what you've said, Erin, is really important for us all to think about. But also, I think you have to, well, all of us, I guess, it's nice to be kind to ourselves and remember as well that in the moment we can't always take everything on board. But what's important is, I guess, how we reflect on that afterwards, and the support that we give to our children when we do that, because we do all do, we do all do that. It's a classic example of having friends to stay and there's an argument, or somebody's upset, and you'll perhaps tend to the visitor first because they're a visitor and they may feel more unsafe in your house, and you perhaps will attend to your child's emotional needs once the visit is over, I guess, won't you? And I'm sure that can be really hard for our children, but the older they are, the more they understand that, I guess, don't they? It's about it's about us all being more open about emotional intelligence, really, isn't it? And having more of these conversations in society, I guess, so that we're not so hard on ourselves, and we're not so hard on other people when they are emotional, because that's just human.
Yeah, I think I have so much I could say to all of that, because it's just been so good. But that's one thing that I've taken away from, excuse me, spending some time reading and thinking about this more is, and I think this is something that I've not struggled hugely with, that I know other people have a harder time with. So I do recognize that. But to become more comfortable and to recognize that it's okay for people to not be happy all the time, essentially, that my kids, it's not my responsibility. I don't want them to be happy all the time, which is funny to say, but that's just not realistic for them to be happy all the time. Not every family gathering is going to go smoothly, and that doesn't have to fall on me or any one single person. So I think that that is one kind of step in moving forward in emotional labor work is, having us individually and as a group, like as a society, tolerating a bigger array of emotions from anyone, our children, the people that we're with, becoming more comfortable with that. And I think that is a cultural thing. I'm sure there's other places in the world that probably are more comfortable with, the harder emotions and stuff. But I want to go back to what you were saying, Erin, about that example with your children, because to me, it really highlights how valuable emotional labor is, because I think it really is really, really important. And so it's not that, like, I think about this as a parent, and I think, what is my role when it comes to emotional labor, and what am I modeling for my children? What are the conversations we're having around this? So kind of like what you were saying too, Haley. I think that's the piece, is recognizing the emotional labor that we're taking on, maybe the emotional labor we're expecting our children to take on, and having conversations about it, which is, I mean, no one had that conversation with me from what I remember when I was a kid. So that's more work. That's another thing to do, I guess. But I think that's, and again, it brings me back to the gender a little bit, because I think we've been more likely to maybe have those conversations with our daughters than our sons. And I think about that quite a bit, because I just want my children to, one, know what emotional labor is, and that will obviously be an ongoing conversation as they grow up, but understand that, like, I go back to the definition of emotional labor, right? Like, recognize when you are filtering or editing the expressions of your emotions for other people, right? Putting other people's feelings ahead of yours. Recognizing when you're doing that, knowing that it's okay to do that, but also knowing that it comes at a cost, how that might feel to you. And making sure, like, I want them to be in relationships with other people and connected with other people where they're on the receiving end of that as well. Because I think that's, like, when I read Rose's book, it was that distribution or lack of distribution, right? Like, it was often one person doing more of the emotional labor when it became problematic. And it wasn't just that it wasn't visible, but they weren't often on the receiving end of it. And that was just going unnoticed, and that's obviously problematic. And what was helpful in the book when I was reading it was, she shared about, I have notes on this, but I think I'll remember, because I think some people will argue and will say, well, females are just naturally better at this. And the book gets into this, which I really appreciated. Now I'm saying, I don't know if this was from her book or the podcast episode. But Rose was talking about how we now understand a lot more around, like, how the brain works, and kind of the motivation behind someone being empathetic. And that it's very very connected to power, Haley, what you were saying, very connected to power and situational, but connected to the motivation. And that, like research studies have shown that males, I think it was boys, but maybe it was with men too, can show just as much empathy as a female if they're motivated to do so. And so that, that kind of gets into the differences on how we're raised, as if we're raised as, a female or male, and the motivation to show empathy to others. And also, what did she say? She talked about how females are often more like monitored or policed and then punished when not doing as much emotional work, whereas boys and men didn't have those same responses that females got, which I think that's pretty important. But the research showed that it's not that females are more capable or more capable to show empathy or do, they're not just better at emotional labor. Although she did point out that grown adults, the females may be better because they've been almost coached and trained their whole life to be good emotional laborers, as opposed to boys and men and their experiences. Anyway, I should probably stop because the book and the podcast episode, they're so good and they get into so much. And I just found it it really breaks it all down. And I needed that because, it was just not something that we talked about. And she has some really, really good examples in there that covers a lot, which I think is just helpful to read. But before I stop, what you said about power, Haley, they get into that in the book, which I think was really key to it's not just about gender, that it's really about the power difference, which can come up in lots of different ways. Like I think about parents and kids, teachers and kids. You mentioned people of color and different things like that. And I think that that's really important, that it does have to do with power and safety. So yeah, lots of good stuff. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I rambled.
No, sorry, Haley. I'll just say one I think quick sentence. The word that comes to my mind when you're saying that, Ashley, is kind of like currency, right? Like some people are not using it in a bad way or even consciously, but it's like a currency for surviving or for managing a particular social situation, is that people pleasing is kind of like a superpower that somebody can bring to the situation. Sorry, Haley, go ahead.
No, I love it. And I'm so looking forward to reading this book. But I was just thinking about how I think the more that because we are a podcast that talks about unschooling and home education, and we often talk about the importance of relationships and connection, and we talk a lot about how we can live with our children in a way that is more of a power with our children rather than power over. And I do think the more that we talk to our children about these things, and the more that we live with them in the kinds of ways that we're trying to live with them, which is where we are where our relationship is what is important, and we're trying to help them to learn more about emotional intelligence. And I forgot my train of thought. I guess the more we focus on things like connection and respect and trust, then the more that our children are able to, I think we talked about this before, haven't we? The more that we can fill them up with those things, the more they're able to give to other people. And that will be, well, they'll still have social pressures that we all have. They'll still live in the society and the culture or whatever that they live in. But I do think the more that we can do that for our children, for our sons as well as our daughters, then the more, we'll see that it's not kind of something that is just about women. And I have 3 adult children, and I definitely have had lots of conversations with my son about friendship groups, and when he's been he's done things in the past where he's got together a group of friends to game, and there's been kind of a community, and he's found himself in that kind of, he's reflected on afterwards about the kind of role of trying to keep everyone happy and that kind of thing. And so I know that that's definitely something that is on his mind. And I just think, that we can't underestimate, I guess, the importance of respecting and trusting our children, and how that can help them to again also to be mindful of what energy they're expending, and to realize that they are important as well, that it's not just about other people's needs, it's also about meeting our own needs. And if they can, if they see us recognizing that in ourselves as well, thinking back to all our kind of episodes we've had about self-care, about recognizing that when we meet our own needs, we're actually better equipped to be able to support other people's needs. And hopefully, I think, I can't remember what the quote is, but there's some quote, I think, about the more our children feel that they're being supported in this way, then the less they're likely to tolerate people not respecting them and trusting them in the future. And I think that's really powerful.
I love all that, Haley. And I think that it's kind of a funny paradox, because as you're saying that, I absolutely, the more that they are seeing people respect their own needs and kind of be thoughtful about their own sort of parameters and boundaries, the more that they will kind of learn probably and acknowledge those for themselves. And I guess it's not really a paradox, but it's just an interesting thing. I think also the more that they see kind of thoughtfulness modeled and talked about, the more that they are able to pour out of themselves when it's needed or when they choose to. So it's kind of this interesting, I guess the word choice comes to my mind, that we make choices. And so I can't remember the exact definition that you read there, Ashley, but I think you made the point that sometimes it's okay to do that. There are times where we do need to put other people's needs above our own. And like Haley, you had been talking about babies and young children when they're still needing so much help regulating and navigating the world. And I would say there are, other stages in life where that's true as well. I found as the kids get older, you kind of have that sense that maybe somebody in this moment is needing more of you than you're needing that part of yourself, so to speak. I mean, another example would be that when you gave Haley, if you have a guest or you have who's maybe not feeling quite as, inherently comfortable because it's not their surroundings. So I think as kids grow up, as much as, there's some conversation about socialization, in homeschooling. And I think those are some of those key pieces, is that developing that emotional intelligence, which is really, really nuanced, to make those, to discern that for yourself. How much do you want to give of yourself? How much do you need to? How much does somebody else need? And then I just see my kids, it's kind of been interesting to see it in both directions. Like I was thinking about, I'm going back to the situation with my cat, simply because it was collective. It wasn't like more one person's loss in the family than another's. So I think it's why it keeps coming up for me. But just kind of being open to how that shows up in different people. So our first attempt at taking him to the vet, he has traditionally had a very, very difficult time going to the vet. It doesn't usually work. It's high drama. And so I knew I would need an extra set of hands. And initially, it didn't look like a day that was going to work for anybody other than one other of my kids. And then that day arrived, and like somebody, another kid shows up, and I was like, I thought you had to work. And he was like, oh, I made arrangements. I figured it out. I don't, I want to be an extra set of hands. Now, he would not be the type to like talk a lot about that ahead of time, but it's just like his actions showed that empathy. And I felt like in that moment, he knew that even though, two of us were going to give it a try, he knew it would be helpful to have his presence. And so again, he didn't articulate a bunch about it. He just made I guess I would call it an act of service. He just made a change, and it was like, there he was. So I feel like that was an example of somebody realizing that somebody else's need in that moment was higher than his. And so he made a choice to switch some things around. And then similarly, Haley, to what you're talking about with like kind of coordinating a gaming group or a social group, you know, I've also had my kids come to a place where they've been in that position too. One with gaming, but I can think of another one with like trying to organize in-person get-togethers and like who's driving and who's picking who up, and you know, plans kept changing, and they would need to book for a certain number of people, but they, you know, just all the things that go with coordinating something, and just kind of making a decision not to continue much with it anymore because it was more emotional labor than he felt was fair to put into the friend group at that point. So not that, you know, not that he's not speaking to people anymore, like, you know, he's friendly enough, but he's not, you know, he's just not going to coordinate that. And I think sometimes we want to think that we're interchangeable, and it's kind of like, well, if you step back, somebody else will just take up the reins, but you know, nobody did. And so there has been a loss of that. But sometimes that just is, again, I guess if we think about it through the lens of choice, we have to make choices for ourselves. How much, you know, in that moment do we keep giving? And maybe for him, he perceived that his need for that time for himself was greater than everybody else's need to have it organized for them. Yeah.
Isn't
so
that, yeah, that's so wonderful.
I don't know where I'm going with that, but it's just, yeah, it's just
well, I think it's really, sorry, Erin, talking over you. I was just going to say, I think that's really wonderful because that's him having good boundaries, making a decision about what is right for him. And that's another thing we want our children to have, isn't it? We want them to be able to say no to things. That we want them to be kind and considerate and caring. Of course we do. But we also want them to be able to say no and recognize that when something is too much for them, that they can't do it. Because I think it's really hard if you're not sure whether somebody wants to do something with you, but they're saying that they do, but you're getting a sense that they don't really want to, then that doesn't feel very nice, does it? It's much better for somebody to have those strong boundaries and say, no, that's not right for me now. And then maybe we can do that later. And then you can both be fully in it rather than feeling like you're doing something with somebody who's not really, we can feel really, that can be not a nice experience. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important, isn't it, for us to feel that other people are being honest with us, so that, and for us to be honest with them, because then it is through that we actually feel more connected. And I can't remember, that's just made me think as well about something we were talking about earlier. And in those times where things, that didn't happen in this situation, but in other situations where things do fall apart a bit more and you get a bit more conflict, perhaps, sometimes in those situations, you can actually forge stronger connections coming out of it. Often, if we're both able to, or if the people involved are able to kind of show compassion and reflection and not take things too personally, often a lot of the time that's where relationship grows, isn't it? Out of points of conflict and vulnerability, I guess. That's where we really get to know people sometimes, and where our relationships get stronger. So it's not, as one of you said, it's not bad if it all goes a bit pear-shaped. It's about what happens from then on in, isn't it, I guess. And I was thinking as well, while you were talking,
go
on, Ashley.
No, go, Haley.
Oh, well, I was just thinking about development, I guess. I was thinking about the fact that I think we have very high expectations on like teenagers and young adults. The idea that in our society, like there's a time where you're suddenly an adult and you have to have things all together. And in actual fact, our brains are developing throughout our lives. And it's not just when we're babies that we need, like I think you were saying, Erin, it's not just when we're babies that we need support. There are other times in our lives where we need a lot of support, and that it's unfair of people to have really high expectations on us. And it can be things like, you know, maybe it's just a developmental thing, but it can also be situational. Like, I guess people who are grieving, you know, we want to be able to give those people a bit, you know, a bit more sort of forgiveness in those times if they're snappy with us, because you can understand that they don't have enough energy to be able to grease the social wheels in the same way that they might have on other times. So, and, you know, and tiredness, and people with, you know, young children, and there are all kinds of situations, aren't there, in society, that perhaps we have very high expectations about how we all ought to be relating to each other. And maybe we could just be a bit more kinder sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, Haley. And actually, I read something just the other day that said, like there's the saying, I'm sure we've said it here, like children do well when they can. And I read something the other day, I think just yesterday, someone shared something around adults do well when they can. And so it just gets me thinking back to that piece around trust. You know, we talk a lot about trusting our children and seeing people as just inherently good, and they're doing as well as they can. And I think we do hear people talk about, like, or I read things, you know, the messaging around, you don't know what's going on in someone else's life. So yeah, it's kind of what I was thinking when you were talking, Erin, about that. It's a give and take. It's really important to think about it and talk about it in our closer relationships, like in marriage or with our children or our close friends, or maybe our own parents, our siblings, like really close relationships that we care the most about, to have those often, like you said, Haley, hard conversations. But that's what allows you to move forward in a healthy way in that relationship. But it is a lot of give and take. And I think it only, you know, emotional labor really becomes just problematic because it's a great thing. Like, emotional labor is so valuable. And I think a big problem is the fact that we don't see it as valuable. We just expect it of people. Oh, I lost my train of thought. But going back to that give and take. And I think that's what I was going to say, was just recognizing that that's it, that it was just going to be problematic in situations, which I do see this. I can think of specific people, specific examples in my life where it seems to be the one person doing pretty much all the emotional labor. And maybe part of that is because the other people in their life have stuff going on that makes it difficult for them to do it. But that's still problematic because, as we've talked about, that emotional work comes at a cost, like the headaches. I mean, you hear people talk about burnout. So I think, yeah, I was just thinking about that give and take, and how you're absolutely right, Haley. Like, depending on, it's easy for us to, or easier for us to almost excuse our younger children from maybe not showing empathy or being really kind in a moment, because a lot of people now have the understanding, well, they're young and they're learning, and, you know, we're becoming more comfortable with that a bit more. But it's so true for anyone of any age. And I mean, there's a lot of people who talk about how the teen years can be really challenging. So that's probably a great example of when we might need to give our teenagers, and they might deserve for us to give a little bit more of ourselves to them during that time. And that doesn't mean that, you know, you can still model boundaries and healthy boundaries and expectations, but just having that understanding that they're maybe not in the space where they can do much more, but that doesn't mean that they're going to turn into an adult who, you know, can't also give in those situations as well. So I think that, and yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat what you've already said, but it would be true for adults too, just depending on, I mean, I can think about it in an even more simplistic way. I would think is just on a day to day. I know my capacity. I mean, you mentioned this, Haley. I think, like, if you're just tired, but I know there's certain times of the month where I have more energy and I just feel better and I can take on more, and I'm able to be more patient with my children and co-regulate more easily with them. And that emotional labor doesn't drain me as much. But then there's certainly other times of the month where I don't have that in me, and I kind of need someone else to step in. And that makes me just think about how we can't just say to someone, just do less emotional labor if you're feeling so tired or burnt out, or if you're doing all of it, because I think it's important to recognize that often when the person doing a lot of the emotional labor stops, there's consequences. Sometimes they're just kind of smaller consequences, but sometimes they can be quite huge, going back to like that piece around power and safety. But yeah, it's very situational.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a really good thing to acknowledge, Ashley, is that as much as we're talking in really, you know, positive and gracious terms, there are times where somebody stopping that kind of holding a big piece of the emotional labor, whether that's in a family, whether it's in a workplace, any number of settings, doesn't actually go very smoothly. And that, you know, that's that kind of indicator that one person is holding probably way too much, at least a little too much, probably way too much. The only other thing that came to my mind, well, there's lots that comes to my mind, but as far as the amount of time we have today, is just how much emotional kind of work it is for people, depending on their personality. Like, I'm even thinking of our children, and I can even think of times with my children's friends, and how much. So let's just say there's a day with a few things planned. Some kids have to work a lot harder to manage the unknown, for example, than other kids do. And so I think that would be true for adults as well, that some personalities, just the anticipating, the so just kind of building that into our awareness. I remember a child that used to spend quite a lot of time with us, and I would feel tired from how many times it would be, well, what time is this? But then what time is my mom coming? Well, when are we eating? And I was like, oh my goodness, this is so many questions. And so it was taxing on me. But once I kind of took a deep breath, and I was like, oh, it's actually really taxing on her to not know all of these steps. Like, she's actually doing a lot of work to kind of, and that would be not so much emotional work as mental work, but having to do a lot of mental work just to kind of get through the day. And I do think there's a lot of people like that it is really hard not to have kind of those things in place. And so I think when we can sort of try to imagine it through their perspective, that can help. It's like the emotional and mental work for me feels a little bit less when I understand that the purpose behind it, or kind of the reasoning that these questions are coming so fast and furious. And I think the opposite of that is that for some people, having too many things planned and too many directives is actually quite taxing and overwhelming. So yeah, I guess it's just back to having that grace for one another, that our brains are all processing things in such different ways. And even the same person, as you're saying, Ashley, might be processing it differently, like week to week or day to day. But yeah, it's a big soup, right, of people trying to get through life, trying to get through their days. And it's, I don't know, I just find it really interesting to look through that kind of like personality lens as well, as far as what helps things flow for people, and what can create sort of stress or anxiety.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, Erin. I think that you just really got into why people do or don't do well in certain situations. And there really is always a reason, and often we can't see it, but that it is so helpful when we are able to spot it or recognize it, or if it's pointed out to us. So I think that's beautiful.
Where are we at? Is there anything else that comes to mind on this topic, or are we tip of the iceberg maybe?
Yeah, I think there's so many things we could talk about. I guess thinking of giving ourselves grace, though, also in terms of that emotion, when I know I've got myself in situations where I'm trying to think ahead and smooth the way for thinking about all my children's needs or whatever, and other members of the family. And I've kind of got myself tied up in knots. And in the end, I've probably ended up causing more problems than I've solved by I think sometimes you can, just being kinder to yourself as well, that you don't have to take responsibility for everybody's emotions, and that you don't have to, I think we touched on this so many times, haven't we? That sometimes, when things go wrong, that it's not actually wrong, and actually out of that wrongness can come some beauty and connection and whatever. So just about being kind to ourselves as well when we try so hard and then we end up feeling like we've pleased nobody or helped nobody. That's not wasted work, or that's not a time to be hard on ourselves. That's just, we're all humans and living human lives. Just
Yeah, it makes
messy
me
and
think.
complicated.
Yeah, it makes me think self-compassion, and how more and more I want to model self-compassion for my kids, because I would love for them to grow up having self-compassion in those situations for themselves.
Yeah, and I guess I do have one more thing actually that just kind of flows from that is consciously building in that time, or even the possibility of that time for ourselves. Like, as I said, I didn't, that in the initial situation I was talking about at the beginning, I imagined myself like having a migraine at the end of the week, and I didn't. But there was something about building in that time and just kind of looking at that weekend ahead, because of course when we have something happen in our lives, whether it's grief or illness or whatever, it's not like there's nothing else happening as well. So there's all the other pieces too. And so for me, I think not overbooking myself, or not maybe making big plans, whereas I think I used to be more of the mind, if I didn't have something on the calendar, I would say, I don't have anything on that day. I would say yes. And more I'm starting to think of, having something on the calendar can be resting after a difficult week or a difficult evening. It doesn't have to be a difficult week. And so just building in that time. And if we might not need to use it in the way we anticipated we might, but there's just something very gracious to ourselves, I think, and just realistic, that we make space for it in case we do, right? Or maybe we don't need the time that day. As you were saying, Haley, sometimes things are later, but there's just still something about acknowledging that, we may need some recovery time or some time to sleep, or just do something fun or whatever that we might not normally. So.
Yeah, I want to just quickly say, I know we're trying to end here, but it's just another example of how this emotional labor is really, like, without having that terminology, without having conversations around emotional labor, or really, reading about, like, all until recently, I'm just thinking as you're talking, Erin, about how, maybe emotional labor was that driving force behind why I intentionally made the choice to start slowing things down. I think I knew in a way. I wouldn't have known as clearly as I do now around how emotional labor is connected to that. But exactly what you're saying, Erin, is because it is work, and it does, it does take up that energy and stuff. It's so helpful, and it's important when we're able to, because I know not everyone's able to, but when we are able to slow down. And I just wanted to mention that here, because I think I've talked on the podcast before, probably quite a bit, about how we've intentionally slowed down as a family. And I think I did do that without really, not that I didn't know why. I could feel the reasons. I could feel that it felt good. But I think emotional labor probably has a lot to do with that. So again, hopefully that's, and I'm not to say that, I'm just thinking about my kids, and I'm sure they're going to go through periods of their lives where their calendar or their schedule, I would look at and go, oh my gosh. And that's okay. I think that's okay to have those times to do that. But just to have kind of what we were talking about here, like that awareness of how's that feeling, and where can you intentionally build in times for rest or recovery, and why that's just good for us for lots of different reasons, mental health and everything. So I wanted to make that connection here, because I think we've talked about slowing down and stuff. So I was just thinking about that, Erin, while you were talking about the calendar and making sure we prioritize rest when we can.
Yeah.
Yeah. And isn't that so much more important if we intentionally, or so much better if we intentionally build in those periods of rest rather than our bodies forcing us to rest by giving us things like migraines or getting poorly or whatever, not that, we still might get poorly, but, it's something to think about, isn't it? It's we devalue rest sometimes in our sort of busy society, don't we?
Yeah, just being that, it's like proactive rather than reacting to the crash. Yeah. Oh, this has been so good. Thank you for, I know this was just kind of like a thought and we weren't too sure where the conversation would go, but I appreciate it. I feel like I'm kind of thinking about it in a few different directions, and it turned out to me to be a really fruitful conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it.
And I guess before we go, I just will mention we have a new button on our, so on the everlearning.ca website, there's a new donation button on the podcast page. So if you feel so inclined, I think the wording is, we appreciate you appreciating us. So if you ever feel so inclined, we would love if you would hit that button and consider kind of donating to our, what would we call this, an endeavor, I guess, that we're involved in together. That would be great. But of course, it'll continue. It's a free podcast. It's just there if you're feeling so inclined. And the other thing I was thinking that we really don't say much about, and we should, is if you have a chance to recommend the podcast or leave us a review or rating, that would be wonderful as well. So we've heard lots of really good individual feedback too, which is really lovely, because it's nice to hear kind of specifically what people are getting out of our conversations. So thank you very much for that as well. And on that note, I guess this is goodbye for now. So thanks, Haley. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And this ends our conversation today. We hope you found it interesting and maybe helpful. If you'd like to connect further or see additional content, Haley can be found on the web and on Instagram at Taking a Kinder Path. I, Erin, can be found at Everlearning, and Ashley can be found on Instagram at Ashley as Mama and Storytime Shelves. We'd be very grateful if you'd share this conversation with anyone you think might appreciate it. Thank you for your time today.